Okay. Okay, I guess tell me when we're live, Katya.
You're live, you can start.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to a live Bruegel event. Bruegel is going to be conducting a wide range of these live events. This one is on data and technology, privacy issues, and COVID-19, because these days just about everything is about COVID-19. We have a very fine set of panelists today, basically chief technology officers from Vodafone, Uber, MasterCard, also a technologist from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, an NGO that specializes in electronic privacy, and Anne Buchte, a senior official from the European Data Protection EDPS supervisor. So again, we've got a good mix of perspectives. This is not the first event that Bruegel is holding online. We're holding a lot of events online. This is the first one I happen to be moderating, but where we normally run about 80 or 90 physical events per year, we've moved our entire program online with only online speakers, and we're actually running more events per week than we did before. Katya, my staffer who's supporting and listening in, is, I think, pulling her hair out because we're doing a lot of these, and I think you'll find them interesting. So I'd encourage you to keep an eye on our events page. Now, for today, our focus is going to be on a cross-sectoral view of these technology and data privacy issues. It's often that you might hear from one sector. I think it's unusual to hear from three of the sectors that have been most prominent in the discussion about how to apply technology to the fight against coronavirus. With that in mind, I've asked each of the speakers to focus, first for those from these three sectors to say a bit about what the key issues are in their sectors, but then to move fairly quickly to what are their sectors doing to help governments and policymakers and planners to fight coronavirus. And also, what options are there to combine different bits of intelligence from across the sectors? Things like this have been done in South Korea, they have been done in Taiwan. They might well raise privacy issues in Europe that are distinct from those in Asia. What are those issues? What can be done to deal with those issues? Really, what kinds of solutions make sense? What should we worry about, and what do we not need to worry about? So that was the sort of discussion that I'm hoping to have for today. Again, we have a very good mix of very well qualified speakers, so I'm very much looking forward to the event. Now, by the way, there is a Slido feed. You will have already seen this on the web page. To access it, you simply need to bring sli.do up in your browser. The hashtag for this is trace, for contact tracing. And with that, you'll be able either to issue your own questions or else to like the questions that were provided by others. I'll be keeping an eye on the Slido feed. I'll tend to be putting most attention onto those that seem to get the most support. So again, pay attention to the Slido, because I'll be paying attention to the Slido. It's your way to get the questions in. We're scheduled to take an hour. We might run a little over that. I don't think we can run a lot over that. But with this many fine speakers, I also don't want to rein things in shorter than I absolutely have to. So we'll see how the questions and answers seem to be running. Okay, now with that in mind, I'd like to turn to the first of our speakers. I'll be taking first the sector speakers from Vodafone, MasterCard, and Uber, then moving to EFF, then to the EDPS. So actually, Mikko Niva, who is the Global Privacy Officer for Vodafone, I'd like to give you the opportunity to start first, and I'd appreciate if you could keep it to something like 5 to 7 minutes for your initial intervention. Thank you, Mikko.
Thank you very much. When the coronavirus started, we were quite quickly as an organization to come up with like a 5-step plan on what can we provide, what should we make sure happens so that our societies can deal with this in the best way possible. So we are very committed to maintaining the quality of services on networks. They are very critical that they work. We are very committed to ensure that the critical government functions get the connectivity and the services that they need. We want to make sure that the public continues to get the information that they are entitled to through our networks and otherwise. Facilitating working from home, helping small and even micro-sized businesses with their challenges. That's been a big theme. And finally, the area that I will be speaking a bit more is the improving the government's access to insights on how populations move within affected areas to provide meaningful information for the decision makers so that they can make the right evidence-based decisions. So for our sector, the insights that we can bring in really relate to the population level movements that we can derive from our networks. We are very, very committed to make sure that this happens in a fully privacy protected manner. So I just want to be very clear that we never actually submit the raw data. We are providing anonymized and aggregated information, aggregated to a rather high level actually, so that it's not possible to trace back from the insights that we have created to any individual. And I guess it's fair to say that in our experience, in our collaboration with a number of different countries across Europe, it's you don't really, when you try to understand the population movements, you are not interested in individuals at all. The aggregations are typically very high level, hundreds, thousands, even hundreds of thousands of users, kind of like in account. So we are in a good position because we have a pan-European platform that enables us to create the insights that local and regional governments need. So we work closely, for example, in Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, elsewhere as well. And we have the capacity to also, create a European level statistics, which I think would be, we believe would be very useful for the governments. Through GSMA, we are engaged with collaboration on the European Commission on similar topics, and I think the insights that we've been able to create have been hopefully very useful, and definitely according to feedback that we received, it's been good. So to give you a sense of what type of use cases we are talking about, they would be like mobility within cities, or before lockdown, this many people moved in this metropolitan area. Okay, what about after the lockdown? How would it work? What were the effects of the lockdown? We are helping to sort of like model different scenarios to assist in determining the ways that we can actually exit from the lockdowns, how the flattening the curve, how is that related to reducing the people movements and things like that. It's been very, very interesting and highly allow me to say purposeful work that we've engaged ourselves in. We also have some collaborations where we run like epidemiological models on top of this data so that we can better understand, we can produce meaningful insights on kind of like a virological point of view, also overlay that body of knowledge with the knowledge that we have in understanding how the various populations move, and I think that's been really, really useful. We've actually in a fairly lucky situation that we've been reusing some of the capabilities that we have created through a couple of different streams. So in some of the African markets where we operate, we have We've been involved in malaria spread predictions, so that's been really useful. But also we've had in a number of European countries, we've had a commercial business to help, for example, public transport authorities to understand how the flow of transportation is moving and how to improve those. So we've been sort of like lucky to be reusing existing capabilities where the privacy protections have been largely integrated already. So I'll pause here in just a moment, but we do understand that the location data, mobile location data, is very sensitive data. So there are particular challenges in relation to the anonymization of such data. There are some articles around that. We are of course very familiar with them. So for us, the key is that whatever the output is that we provide, it's been verified, it's been tested that it is anonymized, and that happens through aggregation to a high level. So we do not only anonymize the identifiers and then share the rest of the data with these anonymized identifiers. We do understand that that would not be sufficient from an anonymization point of view. But we also understand that if the aggregation is not high level enough, or if you overlay certain other information to a very small aggregation count, the data becomes very quickly anonymized. So we have strict procedures in place to, we call it the use case review process, to make sure that we continue to do the right thing here, and that we don't put the privacy of our customers at risk. I'll just pause here maybe.
Good. That's thank you. That's a really helpful intervention. And I think what we're hearing clearly then is when we look at these privacy issues, they're very largely a function of which use case you're in. If you're looking solely at statistical uses, then clearly key is to ensure that there's adequate security and anonymization and aggregation. If that's done, most of the people that have looked at this, including the European Data Protection Board, think that things are probably okay under GDPR, for example. But this is something that we'll be talking about more, and that some of the panelists may have a different view on, for all I know. Good. Well, with that, I'd like to move to the speaker from MasterCard. And Carolyn Niveau is the Chief Privacy Officer, or privacy, I'd say, as someone born in the United States. So I'd welcome your views. From the point of view of your company and from the credit card industry, what really has been done, what can be done, what are the issues? Certainly people are interested in tapping into that sources, and some Asian countries have been doing some integration with credit card data. So I'd welcome your thoughts here.
Thank you.
5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. But let me actually highlight 3 areas of activities where MasterCard we leverage our data, our technology, and our expertise. And so first of all, we leverage our data to help governments, but also to help our customers, which are the financial institutions, to help merchants, and even to help universities and other researchers to really better understand the impact of COVID-19. And we help them, hopefully, also to minimize that impact and to plan for the recovery, because there will be a post-COVID-19 world. And obviously, when we do so, we apply very strict controls to ensure the protection of people's privacy, as mentioned by Nico just a moment ago, and also to protect the security and the confidentiality of the data. So, for example, exactly as we heard just a minute ago, we also always fully anonymize our data and aggregate that data to a level that would be satisfactory, so that there's no risk that any individual would ever be identified in any of our data insight reports. So for example, let me give you 2 concrete examples. We provide spending patterns to airline companies. And as we all know, airline companies are heavily impacted by COVID-19. And so those spending patterns help them really understand the concrete impact on their operations. We also provide data reports to governments about how the virus impacts the consumer behaviors, spending behaviors, all based on macroeconomic trends. And that helps governments plan for the response and really allocates the resources where it's the most needed. And at Mastercard, we've always believed that it's very important for companies to really consider using the data to make a positive impact on society. That's one of our data responsibility principles that we have announced last year. But we also strongly believe that this cannot be done at the detriment of privacy rights. So we really have to maintain those strict standards of privacy and security, even in times of crisis, and embed them in any type of data sharing project. And as you said, Scott, this is really use case related. So it has to be actually reviewed for every single use case. And to make that very clear within Mastercard, what we've done is we have developed a COVID-19 data sharing framework to highlight, the 10 golden rules for data sharing and explain in very concrete and simple terms how the main principles of privacy apply in the context of COVID-19. So what does that mean? Data minimization. What does that mean? Anonymization. What does that mean? Privacy by design, etc. And then we have also set up a data governance steering committee that is composed of our chief data officer, our head of AI, our chief security officer, myself, and many others, really to supervise all our data practices in the context of COVID-19 and make sure that those practices still align with our values and with our privacy and data responsibility principles. And then as a second area of activity and quicker here, we are also expanding and boosting our cyber and fraud capabilities. Because if COVID-19 is a health crisis, it's definitely also a cybersecurity risk. And the criminals have been really quick to take advantage. And we see cyber attacks really on the rise here. So we are leveraging our data, but also our fraud and AI capabilities to really enhance the security of the whole ecosystem. So to give just one example, we are activating cyber screening for all our customers and partners to indicate where fraudsters are most likely to attack. And then we also provide health organizations with cyber assessment ratings. And this is really relevant for the conversation because any type of data sharing is obviously creating some security risks. And so we'll have to make sure that we can anticipate those risks and address them in an appropriate way. And then as a last area of activity, we are also exploring some ways to leverage what we call our key assets, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, to create and to build a trusted ecosystem, obviously in a privacy-preserving way, to enable all of us to go back to our normal lives. So what do I mean by that? Well, Mastercard is a global network, right? Our role is to organize and connect participants, facilitate the exchange of data and information between those participants, with a focus on privacy security, but also governance and global interoperability. And we have, for example, developed a digital identity solution that enables all of us to demonstrate that we are who we say we are when we do online transactions, when we interact online. And this is actually all decentralized and based on privacy by design, which means that you as an individual remain in full control of your data that is stored securely on the device or with trusted entities like the governments. And you decide actually what data you share with who in order to authenticate yourself and to benefit from access to certain services. And obviously, this is relevant today in the sense that our lives have become very much digital. So to wrap up, all those key assets are really essential, at least attractive in today's situation, because they're essential to solve our global crisis and to make sure that the economy can resume. And so we're exploring how we can really play a role here in that trusted ecosystem to connect health organizations, individuals, governments, and maybe telcos and other stakeholders in order to enable all of us to go back to our normal lives, but in a safe, secure, and healthy way. So I'm going to pause here.
Thank you very much, and thanks to both speakers for keeping to the time. So I think a lot of what I'm hearing here is it's not just about helping government planners, it's about helping everybody. You've got a lot of stakeholders to deal with. That's a powerful message. Okay, well, with that, I'd like to move to our next speaker, which is Simon Hanya. and he's the data protection officer for Uber. So what does Uber see, and what do you see in the transport sector? I think you've also got a lot of data here that's relevant.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, as you mentioned, I am the data protection officer, which actually means that European fundamental rights are my North Star by profession. And if you look at what we do at Uber, we operate at the intersection of the physical and the online world. So we connect people, we arrange transportation, and then we bring people physically together. And safety, that was always our largest priority because that's the right to personal security. And if you think about safety, that's largely about human behavior, which you can control. You can be accountable for that. And now all of a sudden COVID enters and health is thrown into this mix. And health, particularly a virus, is not necessarily something you can do something about yourself, contrary to safety. So it's really important to take a different look. We have a muscle, so to speak, to deal with safety, and we need to develop very quickly that muscle to develop with to do with health, because we bring people together in this little box driving at speed. Uh, and a key thing I had to do is to start learning that. So that kept me busy a bit to learn to to talk to the medical experts. So what's key there? And if you then look at the role data plays in this context at Uber, for us, data is instrumental to make it happen. We're completely data driven, and we provide a layer on top of transport services, essentially, and we allow people to set their world in motion. But all of a sudden, that motion stopped. And one of the things we've been doing is looking at what do we do best, which is using data to set people in motion, also in these COVID times. So we've seen a frenzy of new product launches at our company. We all of a sudden start to move around medical people. We start to deliver groceries. We start to deliver pharmacies, and that has a lot of implications. Now, we also receive requests from public health authorities because people have been in contact with each other when they were taking a ride, when food was delivered. And for that, we've basically reused our existing processes we normally use for law enforcement purposes because public health authorities require us to deliver that data, and we can make sure that we do it properly like that. But if you then look at data sharing, one of the key specifics of personal data, which we need to realize, is that personal data is highly contextual and it needs to be fit for purpose. So our data is fit for this transportation context. But by doing so, personal data inherently is an imperfect reflection of people tied to that specific context. It lacks information if you think this is information about an individual. To give you an example, GPS data, which we use heavily, can be off. You will know that. You couldn't find your Uber because the blue dot on your screen wasn't where you thought it would be. Now, we can compensate for that in this context of transport and safety, but it's very hard to do that in a context of health where the stakes are higher. With health, because you can't control it yourself, stigmatization, discrimination are much more a key topic. So when you start then repurposing data, because that's what we talk about, when we start to reuse data from this context elsewhere or even share it, we need to be very, very careful. Now, the legislator has actually looked at this and basically said, if you want to repurpose the data, it needs to be within the reasonable expectations of your user. There's a lot of legal wording, but that's the essence. And if you do not uh, fit within that reasonable expectation, essentially you need to be having informed consent, or there needs to be a law. But a law is actually consent by parliament, if you think of it. So it may not be easy to get it right. It may also create problems with getting consent, but also bias because you do not get data from the consented people. So this is not new actually, because in the transportation sector, we already are subject to a desire for data in search of utility sometimes even. So various cities across Europe have already started to make demands pre-COVID to share movement and location data of individuals. And they use permits as a way to get that. They use it to plan infrastructure or direct the traffic on their territory. And I'm mentioning this because cities have also not made it a secret. They want to be able to proactively intervene in individual behavior on public roads. So the result is that we already see cities move towards what I would call algorithmic oversight of individuals. And I wonder, post-COVID, is that the kind of future we want to live in? So that's kind of the backdrop for which I'm looking at this. And to summarize, for me, this is beyond privacy. This is about control and about freedom, also with anonymous data. Anonymous data is not necessarily innocuous data. Anonymous data is data about groups, and you can inflict harm on groups as well. So it is important that we recognize this as well. We also need to realize that many of the data sets, even the biggest one, in essence, can be a shallow and imperfect reflection of real people. And if we throw these together under pressure, we may be following a recipe for disaster. So what's a better recipe? And I have a few points for discussion for that as well. So I think it's essential that we first define what we need to achieve, understand what success looks like. When do we think we are successful? That requires us to talk to the medical experts, the health experts, the epidemiologists. And then we need to make sure that we define the data that we would need for that, fit for purpose, and it must be accurate because this is health related. We can't make errors. And the next step would then be to understand where we can find it, where we can make the data available, what the limitations are and risks, and how to properly put it together, and then close the loop. Make sure we can measure success and that we remain on the right track. And yeah, I'm sorry, it does take care. It does take time, but yeah, doesn't vaccine creation also take time? Thank you. Scott, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, it works better when I unmute, right? Thank you. Okay, so at this point, we've had three very interesting contributions from three different sectors. At this point, I'd like to move over to Bennett and friend. I see that you're accompanied there, Bennett. So I'd like a technology perspective. We've heard a lot about how the different sectors are trying to ensure that privacy is given due consideration in the things that they're doing. Again, I know a lot has been going on with anonymized identifiers, with various kinds of contact tracing, Bluetooth, and so on. I'd welcome your thoughts here on both as a response to what you've heard and what you see potentially being done in regard to areas, that, especially strategic planning, contact tracing, anything else that you think fits here.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the EFF is a privacy and civil liberties organization that focuses on the internet and the digital world. And so in the past couple of months, a great majority of our work has sort of been subsumed by this COVID crisis. And we've been trying to kind of keep up with all the news and issue our own recommendations as much as we can about how organizations, governments, companies can use their data responsibly in a way that is consentful and transparent, and in order to best combat the crisis. So a couple of things we've been looking at are the use of aggregate data, which has already been talked about a lot by several of the other speakers, as well as I personally have been looking a lot at the contact tracing proposals that have been floating around. I just read the European Commission's report from a few days ago, which was excellent. I think our thinking is a lot in line with them, with a couple of small exceptions, perhaps. So I guess I'll start with the contact tracing, because I think this starts to hit on a lot of the other issues around data use with COVID. So like when the crisis first hit, a lot of what people were talking about in the first kind of iterations of contact tracing was like, we need location data. Like we need to know where people are so that we can know who is near someone else, so we can know who might be exposed, and then we can contact them and we can lock things down. And a lot of the solutions that states rolled out, the states that were hit earlier, like China, South Korea, involved kind of gathering location data, deploying location data, even sharing location data on a large scale with the general public. We saw South Korea would do this thing where when someone was infected, they would release this incredibly extensive log of that person's behavior, movement, activity to all of the people around them. And so this was, this represented a ton of data. It was extremely sensitive. And I think in the estimation of a lot of experts, it was only dubiously effective. It did have some perhaps marginal utility in helping epidemiologists determine who might be exposed to the disease, but it also had other effects, like perhaps chilling effects, where people saw that if they were infected or if they went to health authorities, their data was subject to release and exposure, and that actually encouraged people to not to go. And it kind of weakened trust in the whole system. It led to harassment and things like that. So recently, I think we've seen a second wave of contact tracing proposals, which mostly revolve around Bluetooth, Bluetooth low energy. This was sort of inspired by the Singapore government's initial efforts, although we've come a long way from their sort of centralized model where the government gets to know about all kinds of different people's associations. So in general, our test for this kind of technology is, first, is it efficacious? Is whatever you're doing actually going to work? Do experts believe it's going to work? And is this where we should be putting our resources? Second, after that, is it transparent? Can you describe exactly how it's going to work? Who's going to access what data, and what that's going to look like? Third, is it consentful? Are users given a real significant opportunity to give informed consent? And then finally, is the data that's being collected for this purpose after users give consent absolutely minimized? Is it really the bare minimum that you need to accomplish the specific task that you're trying to accomplish? That's minimization of collection and minimization of purpose. So although, like, we've heard from a lot of epidemiologists that it would be nice to collect data about associations so that they can do research on these kinds of things, or like sort of trace how the disease spreads over time in the future, that is not the same as like granting consent for the purpose of knowing whether you, a specific person, may be exposed to a disease is not the same as granting consent for your data to be used for medical research from here to eternity. And so, like, if people do want to gather that data for those kinds of purposes, it has to be in a separate consent process. So that's the contact tracing. I'm happy to go into more detail about specific proposals in the Q&A, and in fact would love the opportunity to. But I want to talk a little bit about aggregate data as well. And so in this, we have sort of a similar framework. Like, any data that's going to be used for fighting COVID, first, you should upfront say, here's what we're going to do and here's why it's going to be effective. People shouldn't be releasing aggregate and de-identified data sets just for the sake of doing it. It should be to solve a specific problem. Any data that's released, even if it's part of an aggregate and de-identified data set, should be data that was gathered consentfully. And ideally, it should be data where consent was granted for purposes like these, where like the user might have some idea that the company who's sharing their data would be sharing their data for purposes of medical research or what have you. Obviously, that's not always possible in today's world. A lot of the companies like Apple, Google, Facebook that we've seen doing big data dumps didn't have time or the opportunity to update their privacy policies before releasing that data. So as sort of a backup for times like this, where there's a real temporal crisis, you have to make sure that users still have the opportunity to opt out of having their data shared after the fact and remove themselves from whatever data set is going into making this aggregate and de-identified data release. Like, no data utility, we believe, justifies new data collection without consent or undermines users' current rights to opt out of or delete the collection, opt out of the collection or delete the data that's already held about them. And finally, one thing we're kind of watching out for is what's been called COVID washing, where companies that have data that may not have been gathered contentfully, like specifically ad tech, there are a lot of companies that gather data from mobile devices through third-party trackers in apps, have been using this as an opportunity to say like, hey, we have all this great location data. Don't ask how we got it, but look how useful it is. We are helping to solve the crisis. And this is, you can have a free trial of our location data product while the crisis is going. And like, just remember us after, when you're thinking about regulations down the road. Remember that the ad tech industry helped solve COVID. We don't think that that's a Faustian bargain that society needs to make right now. There's enough data that is gathered more or less consentfully, and we shouldn't be giving cover to companies that are bad actors in the data gathering space. So I think that's all I have for now, and look forward to meaningful discussion.
Okay, well, thank you. And at this point, my sound is turned on. So many thanks. I'd like to move next to Anna Buchte from the European Data Protection Supervisor. Anna is the head of unit for policy and consultation there, a senior official. And it seems to me a lot of what we just heard is largely in line with what we've been hearing from the European Data Protection Board, also in a very fine statement that your boss, Dr. Wiewiórowski, made a few days ago. I was working on that name, made a few days ago, where he also talked about the need for informed consent, the fact that data shouldn't be used for third purposes that run counter to the consent that was granted. I think that's all clear. And yet he also made a clear argument that data is there to serve the people, and that basically there should be ways to reconcile this, that's the job that data is supposed to play. So I'd be especially interested in your thoughts. You know, are privacy principles and COVID in conflict, or are they reconcilable? Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Scott, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for this excellent introduction. After listening to previous speakers and now to you, I have actually very little original thoughts left, so I will have to improvise probably. Indeed, let me maybe present a little bit of the EU institutional perspective on all those different data-related initiatives. I think it's pretty clear that already very early in the process, the EU institutions, and in particular the European Commission, started thinking about how to leverage technology and data in the fight against the pandemic, and they also started thinking on how data and insights might help us out of this difficult situation that we are all collectively now finding ourselves in with the lockdowns and strong restrictions on our fundamental rights, which are currently in place in many countries. So my boss, Wojciech Wiewiórowski, I have an advantage here because I'm Polish as well, so I didn't really have to practice. As EDPS, as the main advisor to EU institutions on all matters related to data protection, we have also started engaging quite early. And in particular, we have been advising the Commission in relation to their plan to use telecom aggregated and anonymized location data provided by telecom operators that have been mentioned earlier today. And Wojciech also issued a call for a coordinated pan-European approach to whatever will be done in terms of apps or data sharing or technology use already on the 6th of April. So since then, we've been really very pleased to see that this idea of a coordinated approach has been picked up by the Commission, by the other institutions. There is a European roadmap. There is a toolkit on contact tracing. There is indeed the guidance that has been prepared by the Commission and by the eHealth network, but also the European Data Protection Board, and these are the national data protection authorities from EU, from the EEA states, and also the EDPS all together, have been working a lot in the past weeks, and only yesterday adopted quite specific guidance on the use of location data and contact tracing tools on the one hand, and on the other hand, on the processing of health data for the purposes of scientific research. So this also speaks to a point raised in particular by Bennett just now. So there's a lot of material already there. I will not obviously have the time to go into any kind of details right now, but in terms of maybe key points to remember, I would like to stress the following. I think all DPAs and the EDPB also, and the EDPS as well, we want to stress that the current legislation enforced GDPR in particular is in fact quite flexible, and on the one hand provides safeguards, meaningful safeguards, but on the other hand provides grounds that allow governments, public authorities in particular, to take measures which are necessary for the purposes of combating pandemics, monitoring their spread, and there are specific references to such situations in the recitals of the GDPR to just show that in fact many data uses have been anticipated by the legislator already several years ago. Second, I would very much like to agree with what was observed earlier, that in terms of discussing privacy concerns and also conditions for compliance, we really need to think about specific use cases. So it will all depend on the particularities of any given proposal or case. And here, I think the preferred EU approach currently is one where technology is only one element of an overall exit strategy, or let's say approach by governments and health authorities to pandemics. It's not a standalone single bullet solution, but it also means that probably from one member state to another, we might see slightly different mixes of or combinations of data sharing, app, contact tracing, technology input, combined with social distancing still in place and testing. And so far, within the EDPB in particular, most attention went to indeed the use of, let's say, use of low energy Bluetooth for possible proximity tracing. That was the main focus in this context, and we have not really assessed any other solutions such as enforcing quarantine measures through technology or similar. And in terms of safeguards that would be needed, in my view, in any event, we would like to stress the need for empowerment of the individuals instead of control and repression, which means voluntary adoption of many of those measures. At the same time, and now it becomes a little bit technical, this does not necessarily mean that consent is the most appropriate legal basis under the GDPR. I can go into this a little bit later if there is interest, but voluntary approach and individual control is very important. Transparency, temporary character of any extraordinary tracing measures. So whatever solutions are considered necessary and proportionate under the current circumstances should not necessarily stay with us after the current crisis is over, and strict purpose limitations. So no subsequent repurposing of the data for commercial or law enforcement needs. And I would leave it at that for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for a clear statement. Thanks to all the panelists for really lovely initial interventions. At this point, normally I would turn to the audience. I'll turn to a virtual audience for one question. So Karsten raises a question that app-based tracking can only work if a large number of users will not opt out. So can it work when we need consent? And I think more broadly, I'd raise the question, how do we, there's clearly an externalities issue here. How do we ensure that we get enough participation in any app-based solutions? Korea and China didn't have to worry about this so much, they could compel participation. Thoughts? Who would like to take that first?
I can say something about that. So voluntary is necessary for the most practical reason. If you don't make it voluntary, people will start gaming the system, deceive the system, and you will have an issue with the quality of the data, and an issue with the quality of the data creates false positives, false negatives, reducing trust, sanity gone. So we really need to make sure that we build a system, if we can achieve it, that is trustworthy. I've said at the moment, public officials will carry it themselves. Police officers will carry it. Even intelligence service people will carry it. Then probably we can trust it. And that's how strong this needs to be. And if there's trust and people see the benefits, then they will want to use it. That will take an adoption time. We need to do that properly. But I think we could do that. My worry, honestly, is actually not so much with could we build it. I'm extremely impressed with the technology that has been developed in this space of D3PT. My worry is, can we make the technology available to everybody? So will the elderly be able to have it? Will children be able to have it? Will people with non-smartphones be able to use it as well? In order also to achieve the critical mass required.
Thanks. Anyone else on that one? Or I'll move on to the next. Okay, well, let's see. So there was a request to hear more about the Apple-Google initiative. What are consent criteria in relation to those proposed apps? That was specifically flagged for Bennett, but I think any of you will have probably thoughts on it as well.
Sure, yeah, I can start on that. So around consent for that. So first of all, the Apple-Google proposal, I think it's a relatively good proposal. There are a couple of things that could be a little better about it. For example, when people report that they're infected, it then becomes possible to retroactively link together all of their tokens from a 24-hour period, which does open people who share their infected status up to some kinds of tracking attacks. But for the most part, it's pretty good. It's pretty transparent and decentralized. It doesn't give a central authority a ton of power. And right now it's just an API. So we don't really know how it's going to be implemented yet. They're going to open it up to let other people develop apps. And so we're working on a piece right now that's going to be guidance for people who will be developing those apps. And yeah, consent is going to be critical at every part of it. So that means that governments should not be compelling people to download any of these apps. People should, once they download an app that implements this API, they should be able to freely turn on or off the tracking functionality that it has. And they should also be able to look back at the data that their phone has collected and retroactively delete portions of it if they don't feel comfortable sharing it. And then finally, when they go to a health authority and they get a positive diagnosis, there should again be a consentful process where they can choose whether or not to upload their data. And this is all, again, going to what Simon said about just building trust. Like, people really have to be able to trust these apps in order to use them, because otherwise you can't really force people to download and use an app. They can always turn off their phone, leave it at home, turn off Bluetooth. So they will find ways to opt out if you don't give them ways to opt out. And if you don't give them ways to opt out up front, they're going to lose trust in the system before it has a chance to be effective.
Thanks. Actually, a number of the principles that you just laid out, I've seen in other solutions too, like Private Kit from MIT. Alex Pentland was speaking on one of our previous workshops. So there's some interesting parallels there. Did anyone else want to jump in on that one, or should I move to the next question? Okay. By the way, I'm sorry. Yes, Simon, please.
So these apps, you need to download them from an app store. Effectively, that means there is a register of who actually has downloaded the app. So there is a bit of a leak there, and we should also make sure that governments don't feel an inclination to start compelling the app stores to disclose who have downloaded the app. So there's another level of self-restraint governments need to put onto themselves in order to foster trust again.
Thank you, Simon.
Nico here, maybe
Yes.
I'll say a word on that. I think there seems to be a need to somehow for the various propositions to come together so that there would be a pan-European solution. And I think the technology is probably there. There are multiple options, each with different benefits, different drawbacks. I think the role of government, perhaps in bringing in the trust, overseeing how these things work, how they are being used, is something that would be very important. As we know, we can't force anyone to. Even if we wanted to, even if the governments wanted to, we can't force. It's physically impossible to make everyone use these things. So it's ultimately relies on people's trust on the system, and we all, I think, as technology communities, also have a role to play in making sure that these initiatives appear trustworthy, or that they are trustworthy, and that they appear also trustworthy.
Yes, both appearance and reality are important here. Anna, I think EDPS has also been encouraging a European app, correct?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. And I think, well, however, everything in this field, as you probably understand, is a bit tricky because at least health and public security matters remain to a large extent a national competence in the EU. So a lot of our calls, as well as the Commission action, consist in encouraging and inviting and explaining how only coordinated approach and ideally pan-European coherent approach makes sense. But there is very little by way of hard power that the EU can do here. I think a lot has been done already in those documents that were referred to earlier to point out how things could be done. And indeed, it seems that there might be some kind of coordination going on, but at the same time, we still hear different voices from different member states, with some reportedly already testing or experimenting with applications. I think Austria has done so. Only this morning I read something about Belgium now kind of backing off. For a while it seemed like they were engaged with a number of developers to be able to offer a government solution. Now that doesn't seem to be the case. Maybe Simon has heard more. In the Netherlands, there were also assessments done by government departments and by the DPA of proposed solutions. They were inconclusive so far, if I understand correctly, also because the government has not yet really clearly presented what the exit strategy will consist of exactly. So it is not entirely clear in many cases what this app solution should actually be capable of doing. As I said earlier, I think what we need first is to clearly understand what the exit strategy will be, and we can only hope at a greater coordination between the member states than we have seen at the start of this pandemic. But until such time as this is made clear, what combination of contact tracing, testing, social distancing, still partial lockdowns, until this is known, it will be really very difficult, I think, to assess whether a given application actually does what it is supposed to do and whether they really comply with data minimization and what, in particular, what kind of level of take-up will be necessary to ensure its effectiveness. So I think all that combined still gives us some time to reflect more, and to the technologists that are working on different solutions to to refine their models, and hopefully we will have greater clarity soon.
Thank you very much for that. By the way, the question that we were working on now comes from Len Hawks. I'd like to move to a question that flows very naturally from where we just were. It's from Patricia Suarez, and it's, will the European Commission or any member state use geolocalization to control COVID-19 inside the member state or across Europe? Is this legitimate? So it really is, in many ways, really a natural sequel, a follow-on to what we just heard. You know, we're in Europe. We always have the question, what's the role of the member states? What's the role of the European institutions? And it becomes, as Anna said, especially delicate in areas like health or security. And here we're talking about both areas that are primarily member state responsibility. And yet often we find that a European response is really what's called for. And anyway, thoughts on this, anyone?
Well, let me voice a few things, because we can see this as an issue that Europe can't dictate what needs to be done, but actually that's by design. And I actually think that in this case, it may even be a blessing in disguise, because what we see is that different member states, because of their different population, their different geography, their different local circumstances, are able to take and are doing different approaches. And we are all jointly on uncharted waters. So learning from each other with these differences can actually be beneficial. Heads of governments are now talking to each other. How are you dealing with this? What works in your country? What does it? What doesn't? So it may not be bad, because what we will see is a convergence to what may work as the best solution. And it's the same with these apps, I think. So Anna referred to it. In the Netherlands, we did quite an audacious experiment. In total transparency, over the Easter days, ask 700, I believe, entrances to come up with a solution. They were all immature, but it didn't matter. It triggered the conversation, and we started to learn how to do this. So from a, let's say, perspective of, is this the right way? Would it have worked? No, that was predicted, but that was not the intent. The intent was to show how difficult it is and what we need to do, and to better voice that question in all openness and transparency, rather than a big behind closed doors ICT project of a government. So that's very welcome. And I would encourage every country to do that, because then we can learn from each other. We need to, in order to make the best solution win. That's what we need to do. On this topic of geolocation, my worry again, and I've voiced it over and over, is accuracy. Geolocation, in many cases, may not be accurate. So what are you going to use it for? So we really need to make sure that we do this properly. The same is with the contact tracing. Bluetooth was never designed to measure proximity. If you talk to the Bluetooth specialists, they have great doubts whether it can work. We need to find out how we can make it work, because it's probably the only thing we have, unless we devise new technology. But that's, as I said, like creating a vaccine, and we don't have the time. So we need to have multiple approaches, both with technology, with clever social engineering, I would say, by governments, multi-pronged approach. That's the way to move forward. And align, coordinate, discuss, have the conversation, learn from each other. That's the way to move forward.
That's interesting. My first degree was political science. What they always say about federal systems is that one of the strengths is the ability to have administration and to have experimentation at a lower level, so that different approaches can be tried out, and sort of a Darwinian survival of the fittest.
Yeah, and Scott, that's exactly what I try to avoid, because that sounds like it's a game. No, this is very, very, and it's by design. It's a situation we have. Let's optimize the use of the situation we are in. We may very well decide this is not the right situation afterwards, but that's the way it is.
Okay, good. Before we move on, quick question to Bennett. So do you think Bluetooth will work for this purpose?
I really don't think anyone knows the answer to that. I can list a lot of reasons why it's going to be extremely hard and why it might not work. As Simon said, it's not designed for this. The way that, well, so first of all, there's a huge gap in who actually has phones that have the technology that enables these apps. If you look at smartphone penetration by age. It drops off significantly with age, and so a lot of the people who are most at risk aren't going to have access to phones. It drops off significantly with education as well. So first is smartphone penetration. Second is people carry their phones in different places. They have them turned off. They have them in airplane mode, etc. There's going to be a lot of contacts that are missed by that. And then finally, once you get down to like, even if you have two people who are next to each other with phones that have the technology, that are turned on, activated, everything, the way that these phones estimate whether they're close to each other is using the signal strength, RSSI, which is just like one phone picks up the Bluetooth signal emitted by the other phone and tries to guess how far away it is based only on that one scalar variable. And there are so many confounding factors that go into that, like, is it on one side of their body or another? So does it have to pass through like the water in the human body? Are they on one side of a wall or another? Can the apps tell if it's on one side of a wall or another? Is there glass in between the people? Is someone wearing PPE? Is it an older model of phone that has a different radio signature that the other phone can't pick up on? There's just so many things that make this a really, really hard problem that I'm not saying it's impossible, but like, I think we really have to keep in mind that this is an experimental solution and we should not be putting all or most of or any significant number of our eggs into this basket.
Thanks. Okay, I'd like to move to one more question. And Carolyn, I know you had to leave soon, but you haven't been so engaged in the Q&A, so I'd like to put you to work for a moment, if I might. This one was to you, and it's from Karsten again. Can you imagine use cases where access to other sectoral data could help to bring current financial aid quicker to SMEs or to individuals?
I think this is a great question, first of all. It's about actually the whole question about data combination, right? Combining data from different sectors, different industries. And I think that's actually something that's a desire that was already there before COVID-19. And in Europe, we have the European Data Strategy that has been launched by the European Commission. And that was really actually meant to encourage that kind of data sharing. We have open banking. So we have already actually that knowledge of data sharing within the banking and payment industry. And I think the whole idea was actually that there would be so much value to be able to share data from different sectors and get value. Now, there are many questions actually that come out from that conversation. So obviously sharing personal data is actually subject to a lot of privacy controls and rules, right? But then actually there's a lot of debates about, okay, but let's share non-personal data and anonymized data. But I think actually that we've just seen actually there are lots of questions to that. So I would love actually to do more data sharing across industries, but I think what does that mean really to anonymize the data so that it's the data insights and the data combinations are truly useful for the purpose for what we want to accomplish, for the use case that we had in mind, but at the same time that it's fully compliant with the GDPR, knowing that when you combine data with other data sets, there's always a risk of re-identification. There's also a risk, as we heard from Simon, of bias, discrimination. You know, there could be unintended consequences of combining data from different quality, different formats together. So yes, I think this is something that we are all looking at. But I think there's also lots of questions, and I love the approach from Simon about let's talk to each other. I think we see also right now regulatory sandboxes, research sandboxes to try to combine data from different sectors under the supervision of a regulator or of an independent trusted party. And I think these are all scenarios that should be explored in order to get the most value of all that data, but in a safe, secure, and thoughtful way.
Okay, I'll toss out one question. We're going to need to wrap up in a second, but I'll toss out one of my own. Certainly within GDPR, informed consent is one of the mechanisms, but normally people consent to a particular company for use within that company's application. When we start mixing data from different companies, different sectors, you know, is there any chance of getting cross-sectoral consent? Clearly, the user would need to know what they're consenting to. It seems to me to be a hard problem, but maybe not an solvable problem. Anybody have a thought on it?
I think actually that I can start, but I'm sure that many people have views on that, and Anna seems to have a view. I think to be honest, as we all know, the consent to be valid has to be very specific, right? So
Yep.
the person has to know actually what he or she's consenting to. So, you know, what data are we talking about? With whom that data is going to be shared? What is going to be useful? So and I think actually if you manage to have like one very clear use case, transparent, you know, and there's actually a way to record the consent so that, you know, all the different parties have access and show that they are covered, why not? But if actually it's the idea is to really send the data to a data collaborative for that to be used for all types of different use cases that nobody knows yet today, then I think that's going to be hard. But I'm happy to hear what Anna wanted to say.
Anna, over to you. Oh, you need to
Thank
unmute.
you.
There you go.
Yes. No, I was smiling because at the risk of sounding slightly paternalistic, I like actually pointing out that the GDPR, even though of course consent is there and features quite prominently, there are other legal bases that are available depending on the circumstances. And I think, again, we are back to the use cases, to defining the use case, to defining the purpose, to defining who would be processing what data for which purpose, under what circumstances. And I think that in many cases, we might possibly need some form of new legal framework or sort out you know, conditions by way of opinions from data protection authorities or from other authorities based on existing rules that would typically apply. For instance, in the context of open banking, the rules are already there. They are not always crystal clear, but you know, with a little bit of tweaking through interpretation, you can work with them. In the field of scientific research, it's another field where a lot of work is going on, and there are different sets of rules where we can work with, let's say, data repurposing without necessarily invoking individual consent. So I would just say it will probably depend on the circumstances. And I think Miko had something to add.
Yes, Miko?
I think I totally echo what was said earlier. So consent may be required for some use cases, but then you need to be quite specific, because I don't think it would be okay to consent to repurposing of data in this specific. But then what I would actually echo here is that when we talk about research in particular and combining data sets in those, it's not, I think most valuable use cases do not involve the individual itself. It's more about statistical type of data. So what I think is currently missing, and echoing some of the points that Caroline was also raising, is that do we have enough guidance? Do we know how you actually do an anonymization analysis? I mean, experts come to different conclusions on these topics. Do we actually have a great framework on understanding what are the potential human impacts, or Simon, to refer to some of the excellent points that you raised on this group privacy point? How do we actually assess the potential human impacts that are not necessarily on an individual, based on personally identifiable data, but then you are part of a group and you have information about that group? How do we actually tackle those? So I think the most interesting sort of like regulatory or compliance or, you know, privacy profession developments over the next few years will be around this area, and trying to come up and with ways of maturing the assessment practices, improving our common understanding as a community with the regulators, with the industry, with academia, with the NGO community, find the common language, find the methodologies, even reach an understanding of what are the risks that we are trying to prevent here. I mean, the law doesn't actually give us enough guidance on these things. So we are definitely working in this area, and are very keen to learn from other companies as well on how we can push this agenda forward.
Thank you so much. Well, we're a little bit past the original scheduled time. I'd like to start winding this down. Does anybody feel that they had an important point that they didn't get a chance to get to? Okay, well, hearing none, normally at this point, I'd invite the audience to provide applause for this absolutely wonderful panel. since the audience can't, I will. But thank you very much. This has been really a wonderful session. I very much appreciate you taking the time to speak to everyone today from many different locations, including the United States in Bennett's case. Many thanks. For those of you in the audience, I'd remind you that Bruegel continues to put on more events than before. It's easier to attend them this way than it was when you needed to be physically present in Brussels. I think you'll find our programs interesting. Keep an eye on our events page. With that, I'd like to, once again, with many, many thanks to the panelists, I'll end the session then. Thank you so much. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.